How well will vaccines work? They will not simply eradicate COVID-19. Governments will need to start thinking about how to live with the virus. Even miracles have their limits. Vaccines against the coronavirus have arrived sooner and worked better than many people dared hope. Without them, the pandemic threatened to take more than 150 million lives. And yet, while the world rolls up a sleeve, it has become clear that expecting vaccines to see off COVID-19 is mistaken. Instead, the disease will circulate for years and seems likely to become endemic. When COVID-19 first struck, governments were caught by surprise. Now they need to think ahead. To call vaccination a miracle is no exaggeration. A little more than a year after the disease was first recognized, medics have already administered 148 million doses. In Israel, the world's top champion inoculator, hospital admissions among those aged below 60 who have not received a jab are higher than ever. By contrast, among the largely inoculated over 60s, they are already nearly 40% below their January peak, and they will fall further. Even though vaccines fail to prevent all mild and asymptomatic cases of COVID-19, it seems they mostly seem to spare patients from death and the severest infections that require hospital admission, which is what really matters. Early evidence suggests that some viruses stop vaccines spreading too. This will This will greatly slow the this will greatly slow the pandemic, and uh, thus make it easier to alleviate lockdowns without causing a surge of cases that overwhelms intensive care units.
Surge of cases that overwhelms intensive care units. Those findings, and many more, will harden up over the next few months as more data emerge.
Those findings and many more will harden up as more data emerge over the next few months.
However, despite all this good news, the coronavirus is not finished with humanity yet.
However, despite all this good news, the virus is not finished with humanity yet.
COVID-19 will continue to circulate widely.
COVID-19 will continue to circulate widely.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans, as the Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore.
There is a growing realization that the virus will find a permanent home.
Our new podcast, there is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans, as the Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans. The as the Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore. That has profound implications for how governments need to respond.
One reason the coronavirus will persist is that making and distributing enough vaccine to protect the world's 7.8 billion people is a Herculean task.
One reason that the coronavirus will persist is that making and distributing enough vaccine to protect the world's 7.8 billion people is a Herculean task.
Which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country, will not finish with the over 50s until May.
Even Britain, which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country, will not finish with the over 50s until May. To add to the burden, the potency of a jab may fade, making boosters necessary. Outside the rich world, 85% of countries have yet to start their vaccination programs.
Until the billions of people who live in them have felt the prick of a needle, which may not be before 2023, they will remain fuel for the virus.
Until the billions of people who live in them have felt the prick of a needle, which may not be before 2023, they will still remain fuel for the virus.
Have felt the prick of a needle, which may not be before 2023, they will remain fuel for the virus. Another reason for COVID-19's persistence is that even as vaccines are making SARS-CoV-2 less infectious and protecting people against death, new viral variants are undoing some of their good work.
Another reason for COVID-19's persistence is that Even vaccines are making SARS-CoV-2 less infectious, and
Viral variants and protecting people against death.
protecting people against death. Some new viral variants are undoing some of their good work.
New viral variants are undoing some of their good work. For one thing, successful variants are more infectious, anything from 25 to 40% in the case of B117, which was first found in Britain.
For one thing, successful variants are more infectious, anywhere from 25 to 40%. In the case of B117, which was found in Britain.
Infection is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth, so cases and deaths accumulate rapidly, even if the variant is no more deadly.
Infection is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth, so cases and deaths accumulate rapidly, even if the new variant is no more deadly.
To get a given level of viral suppression, more onerous social distancing is needed.
To get a given level of viral suppression, more onerous social distancing is needed.
In addition, new variants may withstand current vaccines.
In addition, new variants may withstand current vaccines.
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa may also be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous COVID-19 infection.
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa may also be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous COVID-19 infection.
The hope is that such cases will be milder because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
The hope is that such cases will be milder because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate, finding unprotected people. And because this is what viruses do, evolving new strains, some of which will be better at evading the defenses that societies have mounted against them.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate, finding unprotected people. And because this is what viruses do, evolving new strains, some of which might be better at evading the defenses that societies have mounted against them.
And the third reason SARS-CoV-2 will persist is that lots of people will choose to remain a target by refusing vaccination.
And the third reason that SARS-CoV-2 will persist is that many people will choose to remain a target by refusing vaccination.
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease because of their age or underlying conditions.
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease because of their age or their underlying conditions.
Modeling suggests that if 10% of them declined to be vaccinated, and if social distancing were abandoned while the virus was still liable to circulate at high levels, then a tremendous spike in infections and deaths would result.
Our modeling suggests that if just 10% of them declined to be vaccinated and social distancing were abandoned while the virus was still liable to circulate at high levels, a tremendous spike in infections and deaths would result.
In reality, the share of the population that remains unvaccinated
is likely to be much higher than in that thought experiment.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Minority communities in many countries, which are most vulnerable to infection, tend to have less trust in the government and the medical establishment.
Minority communities in many countries, which are most vulnerable to infection, tend to have less trust in the government and in the medical establishment.
Some care workers, as many as half, refuse vaccination, despite having seen the ravages of COVID-19 at first hand.
Even among healthcare workers, as many as half refuse vaccination, despite having seen the ravages of COVID-19 at first hand.
With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population needs to be immune for an infected person on average to pass on the disease to less than one contact, the threshold at which the epidemic subsides. With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population needs to be immune for an infected person on average to pass on the disease to less than one contact, the threshold at which the epidemic subsides.
With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population needs to be immune for an infected person to pass on the disease on average to less than one contact, the threshold at which the epidemic subsides. That will be a tall order.
For all these reasons, governments need to start planning for COVID-19 as an endemic disease.
For all these reasons, government will need to start planning for COVID-19 as an endemic disease.
Today they treat it as an emergency that will pass.
To
see how those ways of thinking differ, consider New Zealand, which has sought to be COVID-free by bolting its doors against the world.
To see how those ways of thinking differ, consider New Zealand, which has sought to be COVID-free by bolting its doors against the world. In this way, they have kept the registered death down to just 25, but such a draconian policy makes no sense as a permanent defense. New Zealand is not North Korea.
As vulnerable Kiwis are vaccinated, their country will come under growing pressure to open its borders and hence to start to tolerate endemic COVID-19 infections and deaths.
As vulnerable Kiwis are vaccinated, the country will come under growing pressure to open its borders, and hence to tolerate endemic COVID-19 infections and deaths.
Across the world, governments will have to work out when and how to switch from emergency measures to policies that are economically and socially sustainable indefinitely.
Across the world, governments will have to work out when and how to switch from when and how to switch from emergency measures to policies that are economically and socially sustainable indefinitely.
The transition will be politically hard in places that have invested a lot in being COVID free, nowhere more so than China, where vaccination is slow.
So the transition will be politically hard in places that have invested a lot in being COVID free, and nowhere more so than China, where vaccination is slow.
The Communist Party has defined every case of COVID 19 as unacceptable, and wide circulation of the disease as a sign of the decadence of Western democracies.
The Communist Party has defined every case of COVID-19 as unacceptable, and a wide circulation of the disease as the decadence of Western societies, democracies.
The adjustment to living with COVID 19 begins with medical science.
The adjustment to living with COVID-19 begins with medical science.
Work has already started on tweaking vaccines to confer protection against variants.
The work has already started on tweaking vaccines to confer protection against new variants.
Go along with more surveillance of mutations that are spreading and accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
That should go along with more surveillance of mutations that are spreading and and accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
Treatments will be required to save more of those who contract the disease from death or serious illness.
Meanwhile, treatments will be required to save more of those who contract the disease from death or serious illness.
Will be for a combination of acquired immunity, regular booster jabs of tweaked vaccines, and a menu of therapies to ensure that COVID 19 need rarely be life-threatening.
The best outcome would be for a combination of acquired immunity, regular jabs of tweaked vaccines, and a menu of therapies to ensure that COVID-19 need rarely be life-threatening.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
To the extent that medicine alone cannot prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID 19, the burden will also fall on behavior, just as it has in most of the pandemic.
To the extent that medicine alone cannot prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID-19, the burden will fall on behavior, as it has in most of the pandemic.
But rather than national lockdowns and months-long school closures, which come at a huge price, the responsibility should fall more heavily on individuals.
But rather than national lockdowns or month-long school closures, which come at a high price, the responsibility should fall on individuals. The responsibility should fall more heavily on individuals.
Habits like mask wearing may become part of everyday life. Vaccine passports and restrictions in crowded spaces could become mandatory.
Habits like mask wearing could be part of everyday life. Vaccine passports and restrictions in crowded places could become mandatory.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education and encouragement, but limited protection.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education and encouragement but limited
As
protection.
our special report on the travel industry makes clear, people's desire to live their lives will ultimately be hard to resist, even in autocracies like China that may be reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
As our special report on the travel industry makes clear, people's desire to live their lives will ultimately be hard to resist, even in autocracies like China that may be reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
The persistence of acute infections and chronic debilitating long COVID means that the next stage of the pandemic sounds grim.
The persistence of acute infections and the chronic debilitating long COVID means that the next stage of this pandemic sounds grim.
But even if COVID-19 has not been completely put to rest, the situation is immeasurably better than what might have been.
But even if the COVID-19
Completely. But even if COVID-19 has not been completely put to rest, the situation is immeasurably better than what might have been.
But even COVID-19 has not been completely put to rest, the situation is immeasurably better than what might have been.
The credit for that goes to medical science.
The credit for that goes to medical science.